Hi class, welcome to our first lecture, part B, that's lecture 1B. In part A of this lecture, we talked about the Peace of Westphalia and how it created sovereign and respected borders, essentially European powers agreeing to respect the sovereignty and the borders of other countries. Now, while that created peace, there have been attempts throughout history of some European nations to dominate others. We call this hegemony. Okay, hegemony is seeking to dominate other countries. You can make the argument on a more global scale that the United States is a hegemonic country globally, the most powerful, undisputed country in the world. Of course, there's counter arguments to that with the rise of China, et cetera. But hegemony is the attempt or the domination of other countries. And as I said, there have been multiple attempts throughout European history to do this. We've seen it by Austria in 1618 during the 30 Years' War. We've seen it by King Louis in 1661. And we've seen it by Napoleon from France, who was ultimately blocked by a coalition of Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, which is normally what you'll see, right? When one country tends to try to dominate, become a hegemonic country, you'll see other European countries group together to stop that country, right? And we also saw that during World War II to stop Hitler, but we'll talk about that later. So after the Napoleonic Wars, you see another major gathering of European nations in an attempt to try to regain the peace that resulted from the Peace of Westphalia, reestablish that precedent. And in many ways, it was an attempt to oppose the change that was happening due to the French Revolution. So other European nations saw what had happened to France during the Revolution and wanted to avoid that in their own nations. So the Congress of Vienna, it reaffirmed and repartitioned, in some case, redrew some territory lines. And ultimately, we can credit the Congress of Vienna, again, which took place in 1814, 1815, as creating about 100 years of peace in Europe. So certainly effective, basically a regathering of the Peace of Westphalia that created an additional 100 years of peace. And it reaffirmed this respect for sovereignty in the nation state system that was created in the Peace of Westphalia that we still have today. Of course, that peace would end about 100 years later when Germany, during World War II, tried to establish hegemonic state across Europe. Of course, they were blocked by a coalition of the Allies in Europe, the Britain, France, United States, Soviet Union, et cetera. We all know how that ended for Hitler. So then we enter into a period after the fall of Germany, after the end of World War II, what we call generally the Cold War. Okay, and we're not going to go into too much detail about the Cold War. This isn't a history class. We're just kind of trying to get up to our current nation state system. So until the end of World War I, there existed a multipolar system. We talked about this with the creation of the Peace of Westphalia, right? Many dominant European nations existing together. That's a multipolar power system. After the Cold War started, the multipolar system kind of dissolved into a bipolar global system, right, between the Soviet Union and the United States, meaning that there's two major world powers, right? Two major world powers. And it was really an ideological war between what economic and ultimately political system could be more successful, capitalism or communism. And while each country was deadly afraid of the other, they began to stockpile nuclear weapons, creating an arms race. You know, the United States was the first country to create a nuclear weapon, Soviet Union not far behind, but you want to be more powerful than your rival. So the United States creates one, Soviet Union creates two, United States creates 10, Soviet Union creates 20. Before you know it, each country has thousands of nuclear weapons, enough to blow up the entire world 100 times over. Okay, that's an arms race. You want to be more powerful than the rival. Here's an interesting video on the Cold War if you want more of a historical context. You're not mandated to watch this, but if you don't know a lot about the Cold War, it's very interesting. So I recommend that you do so. So the Cold War would end when the Soviet Union disintegrated at the end of the 20th century. Maybe some of you are old enough to have been alive when that happened. I was just very young when it did happen. And for the first time, the US was considered a unipolar power. So if we had a bipolar system when Russia and the United States were the most powerful country, when the Soviet Union dissolved, it would make sense that there was only one major world power left, and that power was the United States. So we entered into a unipolar power system. One state, the US, dominating the international system. And again, you can make the argument that this is still the case. You can also make the argument that we're kind of reverting back to maybe a bipolar system with the rise of China, economically, certainly, and militarily, it seems like they're growing as well. So, the United States as a unipolar power has had to work very hard to maintain its status. And part of that is its very large military budget. The United States spends approximately $600 billion a year on its military, which, as you can see, is much, much more than other countries. In fact, it's bigger than, I believe, the next 19 countries' military budgets combined. So we spend a ton on our military to preserve our status as a hegemon in the world, to preserve our status as a global superpower. And part of that, guys, is we have security agreements with other nations. So we have agreements with countries like South Korea, for example, where if they're attacked, you're essentially declaring war on the United States. And I said 19 countries, my mistake. The United States budget of defense is bigger than the next 17 countries combined, which is still obscenely large. We also have military bases around the world and a very vast and very deadly nuclear arsenal. We have, again, more nuclear weapons than we could ever need, enough to blow up every territory in every country in this entire world. Okay? That's how vast and destructive our nuclear capabilities are. So now we enter into today's international system. We've been kind of building up to this. We talked about ancient Greece. We talked about the Dark Ages. We talked about a multipolar Europe. Talked about the Peace of Westphalia, the Congress of Vienna, into a bipolar system, into a unipolar system, into today's international system. And I've said it a bunch of times. The international system we have today was created by the Peace of Westphalia, and it still largely exists with some alterations. Of course, we know that, as I pointed out before, the sovereignty of states is not always respected. We still see some states push for homogeny, and even states like the United States are guilty of not respecting the sovereignty of other nations. We've seen Russia annex the Crimea. Is that respecting their sovereignty? Well, it's complicated because some consider them ethnically Russian, but certainly not respecting their sovereignty. We've seen the US, through their Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, infiltrate the political systems in Central and South America. Is that respect for sovereignty? Certainly not. Okay, we've seen China refuse to respect the sovereignty of Taiwan. So while the system that we created in the Peace of Westphalia exists, we can't pretend like it's adhered to perfectly. Many countries, many powerful countries, because we need to be powerful to do this, sometimes do not respect the sovereignty of independent nations. Okay? So to end this lecture, I have some questions for you guys just to think about. You don't need to answer these. You do have your discussion post questions that you do have to answer. Will our current nation state system created in the Peace of Westphalia last, or will this trend of maybe not respecting other nations' sovereignty continue to a point where the system created in the Peace of Westphalia breaks apart? And if it does break apart, which it might someday, it could be hundreds of thousands of years, but it probably will someday, what other type of system might rise up? And our last question I asked a couple times before, is the United States still the sole world superpower, or is there another country that has closed the gap enough, like China, to where maybe we're not a hegemon, a global hegemon anymore? So that's going to conclude our first lecture, guys. Please tune in next week to lecture 2.